Hey guys, over the last year or so, there has been a lot of talks about Russia's nuclear threats to Ukraine and basically anyone that doesn't openly allow Russia to massacre Ukrainians. But Russia has already been committing nuclear terrorism in Ukraine by trying to take over the Chernobyl power plant and by actually taking over the Zaporizhzhia power plant. Of course, Russia forgot to tell their soldiers that Chernobyl was still a radioactive zone, which meant that they were digging trenches in mud dripping with poison. But don't let me get in the way of Russia destroying Russia's military. With this going on in the background, it's important to discuss collective security and irresponsibility, specifically regarding Chernobyl and Zaporizhzhia. On April 26, 1986, one of the world's largest technological disasters occurred, the explosion of the fourth reactor at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. I think you're quite familiar with this issue from history lessons, media, and series like Chernobyl that detail the cause and consequences of the disaster. After the start of the full-scale invasion, Ukraine and the world has faced the threat of nuclear terrorism from the occupiers who captured the city of Enerhodar and the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Why is this place so important to Russians, and why did they want to get there? It is the largest nuclear power plant in Europe, and the attacks and eventual capture by Russian forces began in the evening of March 3, 2022. By the morning of the next day, Zaporizhzhia NPP was under the control of the occupiers. Immediately after the occupation, Ukrainian experts began to record massive violations of nuclear and radiation safety, from forcing employees to work at gunpoint to using heavy weapons on the facility. By the end of May, the occupiers had deployed about 50 units of heavy equipment and over 500 soldiers at Zaporizhzhia NPP. Essentially, the invaders set up a military base with an arsenal of heavy weapons on a civilian nuclear site. Considering the purpose of the NPP, the occupiers were not worried about controlling the shelling of our troops and began to shell the neighboring city of Nikopol with impunity. What were the Russians' goals? Now, I want to point out, I'm not a nuclear physics, so I will be speaking from the perspective of political and military one. First, there is a constant fear of the explosion of one of the reactors and a large-scale ecological disaster. The prospect of pollution in their own territory doesn't concern the Russians too much, but Ukraine and the rest of Europe, and most likely the rest of the world, does. Second, it's a constant threat that Russia can activate when needed to cause alarm before key events like Ramstein format talks or the extension of the grain agreement. Third, the Russians don't want the Zaporizhzhia NPP to generate electricity to power Ukraine. We all remember the shelling of Ukraine's power grids and the lack of electricity during this previous autumn and winter. Fourth, before the annexation of Crimea in 2024, the peninsula had an electricity deficit and received it from other regions of Ukraine. Since then, the Russians have managed to supply electricity to the peninsula, but additional capacity will certainly not be unnecessary. The Russians fight on both the informational and psychological battlefields, and one of the main purposes of my videos is to reach and share with you what is real and what is not real, specifically about Ukraine. Before we go on, for those who have already supported these videos, thank you so much, as making them would not be possible without you. And if you would like to support this channel, you can do so through my Patreon or through Buy Me a Coffee. Links are in description below. Okay. So this is a good point to remind you. Russian occupiers seized the largest nuclear power plant, brought in a lot of weapons and explosives, and began to actively blackmail the world community with their presence at the nuclear power plant. Okay, so Russia threatening the world is nothing new, and it is what they want. However, it's more important to discuss why the threat of reactor explosions is so big. To start with, it's important to understand exactly what this would mean, neither exaggerating nor downplaying the potential consequences. On the internet, you can hear certain speculations about the number of power units at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. There are 6, and about the huge force of a possible explosion. I will explain. The power units are located nearby, so even if they are all explode together, there won't be a huge terrifying stain on the entire country, although, of course, radioactive pollution near the epicenter of explosion will be incredibly powerful and destructive. Next, everything depends on the state of the reactors themselves. That is, if all reactors are working at full capacity, the force of the explosion will be enormous, but if only a couple of reactors are fully engaged, the force of the explosion will be significantly smaller. The explosion's strength also depends on whether all reactors will explode simultaneously or if it will be a series of explosions. Another important factor is the direction of the wind and weather conditions in general. Many people know that the regions most at risk are those in direction the wind will blow, but the pollution of individual territories depend on precipitation, primarily rain. In any case, the immediate pollution of the surface will not lead to critical consequences for people, but the entire population of polluted territories will need to be evacuated, and the territory itself will be unfit for living for some time. The area of contamination can be something like 300 kilometers. The main thing you need to understand is that Zaporizhzhia NPP is not an explosion like Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but it's still a significant danger that can impact the lives of a huge number of people and create an environmental disaster in the region. Russians exploit people's fear first, trying to launch appropriate information psychological operations and thus influence the decisions of the world community. Shooting civilians, torture, looting, and war in general are fundamental values that Russia brings to Ukraine and the world. That is why we must win and eliminate this threat. Slava Ukraini!